He was a good winner, but sometimes a sore loser. Elvis wants to see you in the dressing room. I said, oh no, here we go. I just knew he was gonna come down on that guitar.
He was kind, but troubled, a legend, but also a man. At 85, James Burton, the guitarist Elvis trusted more than anyone, has finally opened up about what really happened behind the curtain. For decades, he kept quiet. But now, he's telling it all. Was Elvis truly the generous, soulful man his fans adored? Or was there another side? What did James witness during Elvis's final years? And why has he waited this long to speak? Let's explore never-before-heard truths, emotional memories, and shocking behind-the-scenes moments from the man who was there every single night. Elvis lit up the stage. The real Elvis revealed. In the summer of 1969, James Burton received a call that would change the course of his life. On the other end was none other than Elvis Presley, gearing up for a monumental return to live performance. After years away from the stage, Elvis was preparing for a Las Vegas residency at the International Hotel, and he wanted James to lead the band. But this wasn't just any request. Elvis didn't simply want a guitarist. He wanted Burton to build an elite team of musicians from scratch. "Pick the best," Elvis told him. That single sentence carried an unmistakable weight. It was a message of total trust, and James knew exactly what it meant. He wasn't signing up for a gig. He was stepping into a lifelong bond. From the very first show, Elvis made it clear how much he relied on James. During their performances, he'd often turn mid-song, grin, and shout, "Play it, James!" That phrase became iconic, not just to the audience, but within their inner circle. It was more than a cue for a guitar solo. It was a moment of mutual understanding, an acknowledgement that James was the anchor of the sound Elvis had been chasing. Over the next 8 years, James would perform with Elvis night after night, city after city, in front of millions of fans. And while the stage lights shined bright, it was what happened backstage that James remembers most vividly. For decades, Burton stayed quiet about those behind-the-scenes moments. But now, as he looks back at a life filled with music and meaning, he's sharing details that fans have never heard. According to James, Elvis was deeply complex. While the public saw the jumpsuits, the charisma, and the swagger, the man behind the image was someone often battling internal storms. James remembers Elvis's unusual habits, his preference for staying awake through the night and sleeping during the day, his strict control over his personal space, and his fascination with spirituality and the unknown. He wasn't just a man of music. He was a man in search of peace. He'd talk about God, about life after death. James recalled in a recent conversation. You could tell he was looking for something more, not just fame, not money. He wanted meaning. Elvis had a Bible nearby almost all the time, and often asked James and the other band members to join in singing gospel songs just for themselves, long after the crowd had left. Those were the moments that stuck with James. Not the curtain calls, not the screaming fans, but the quiet sessions where Elvis seemed most himself. But the later years weren't easy. As the 1970s wore on, James began to notice troubling changes. Elvis, once so energetic and sharp, began to slow down. His weight fluctuated, his moods darkened, and his body, pushed to the limit by grueling tour schedules and mounting personal stress, started to betray him. Still, Elvis refused to stop. He lived for the stage, James said. Even when he shouldn't have been out there, he was. Burton now admits that he believed the final tour in 1977 should have been canceled. He was too tired, he said softly, too worn out. But he kept going. That's what made it so hard to watch. You knew he didn't have much left. James's reflections don't come with bitterness. There's sadness, yes, but also deep respect. He witnessed firsthand how much Elvis gave of himself, even when there was barely anything left to give. The connection they shared wasn't rooted in fame. It was built through music, loyalty, and mutual understanding. Elvis wasn't perfect, but to James, he was real. And that's what made him unforgettable. And yet, James didn't just see the downfall, he saw the beginning. The story of how he met Elvis is rooted in a completely different chapter of his life. From Shreveport to stardom. Before the Las Vegas lights and roaring crowds, James Burton was just a kid from the South, quiet, curious, and completely obsessed with the guitar. Born on August 21, 1939 in Daberly, Louisiana, Burton didn't come from privilege. His parents, Guy and Lola Burton, lived a modest life, and music was more escape than luxury. But something about the guitar just made sense to James. He didn't learn through formal lessons or sheet music. He picked up the instrument and taught himself to play by ear, mimicking melodies, experimenting with rhythm, and developing a style that would one day influence the entire rock and roll world. By the time he was 15, James had already stumbled into something iconic. While playing around with riffs and arrangements, he came up with the electrifying opening that would become Susie Q. The song, recorded by Dale Hawkins in 1957, turned into a rockabilly hit, and decades later would be reimagined by Creedence Clearwater Revival. But back then, young Burton got no credit, not as a co-writer and not in the royalties. Still, that riff marked the arrival of a sound, a tone, and a talent that couldn't be ignored. People started to talk, not just in Shreveport, but in Hollywood. Burton's break came with another rising star, teen idol Ricky Nelson. At just 18 years old, James was recruited to join Nelson's band, playing rhythm guitar before quickly taking over lead duties. But the music was just one part of the story. Ricky invited James to move in with his family, the iconic Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. For the next 2 years, James lived in the Nelson household and became like a third son. It was a dramatic change from his Louisiana roots. Suddenly, he was in the middle of Hollywood, living among television stars and performing weekly on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which featured Ricky's songs at the end of each episode. That exposure skyrocketed Burton's career. His tight, clean playing became a staple of Nelson's hits throughout the late 50s and early 60s. He was barely out of his teens and already crafting a signature sound that blended country picking with the raw edge of rock. In truth, fans may have come for Ricky Nelson's voice, but many stayed for James Burton's guitar. Keith Richards famously said, "I never bought a Ricky Nelson record, I bought a James Burton record." That wasn't just flattery, it was fact. Richards wasn't the only one in the world paying attention. Young hopefuls such as Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck in the smoky backrooms of Britain would listen to American records, dissecting them to the last note. Big Jim Sullivan, a legendary UK session guitarist and longtime sideman for Tom Jones, recalled that his students, Page and Beck included, were desperate to learn to play like him. His influence had already crossed oceans and cultures before he had even stepped foot into an arena. Even with all the glory and glamour, however, James stayed humble. He was not chasing fame, he was busy chasing music. After his exit from Nelson, he became one of the most sought-after session players in Los Angeles, playing sessions with names legendary and infamous alike, cutting tracks for the ones that would come to be the condolence songs for his generation. With all the big names he cut with, from Merle Haggard to Emmylou Harris, There was one name there in the background. One figure had been watching, listening, and waiting. But one fan wasn't just watching. He was planning. And when Elvis came calling, it was no casual request. It was a mission. Building the TCB Band, Elvis's Army. By 1969, Elvis Presley was ready to return to the stage, but this time, he didn't just want to perform. He wanted to redefine himself. After years of making movies and stepping away from live music, Elvis was planning his big comeback at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. But he needed more than just a group of backing musicians. He wanted a team, a brotherhood, something powerful and lasting. So when he called James Burton and said, "I want you to build the band," he wasn't handing off a task. He was entrusting James with the heartbeat of his second act. Burton took the responsibility seriously. He handpicked each member of what would become known as the TCB Band, short for taking care of business, a motto Elvis carried with him in everything he did. The lightning bolt insignia they wore symbolized speed and power, and the band would soon live up to that image. With musicians like Glenn D. Hardin on piano, Jerry Scheff on bass, and Ronnie Tutt on drums, the TCB Band wasn't just talented, they were tight, focused, and unshakably loyal. At the center of it all was James, the silent leader whose guitar anchored every performance. Burton might have passed the general public for just one more sideman, but to the king, he was much more. Trusts, secret but indestructible trust. Elvis knew he could count on James to play not only the notes, but also the feeling of the music with him. So, for night after night, when guns for hire, the moment comes for a blazing guitar solo. Elvis would pause, flash a grin, and shout across the stage, "Play it, James!" The audience would go wild. Burton would play it straight and right on time, never flamboyant, and he'd do it with just the right touch. It became a ritual, a signal that the king was backed by the best. But those live shows were about more than just sound. They were about sight. And Burton made a bold move early on that almost didn't come to be. One day he showed up at rehearsal with a pink paisley Fender Telecaster. Loud and ostentatious, it didn't remotely offer up the traditional instruments one would expect to see on a Vegas stage. At first, he had his doubts. Would Elvis, the constant appointment of image and presence, think it probable that it looked ridiculous? To his surprise, Elvis loved it. Rather than reject the bright guitar, Elvis embraced it and encouraged James to play it on stage. That pink paisley Telecaster quickly became part of the TCB Band's identity, just as much as the lightning bolt or Elvis's rhinestone-studded jumpsuits. Burton's confidence in bringing something bold and unusual into the mix only deepened their creative connection. Elvis trusted James not just to play, but to help shape the visual and emotional energy of the show. For nearly 8 years, the TCB Band traveled across the country and performed hundreds of concerts. They weren't just a group of musicians on tour, they were a family on a mission. Elvis wasn't easy to work for. He demanded perfection, but when he gave you his trust, he gave it completely. And for James, that trust meant everything. Behind every solo and every spotlight moment was a friendship built on mutual respect, shared faith, and deep admiration. James didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't crave headlines, but he became one of the most visible and respected figures on Elvis's stage because of how much he brought, not just as a guitarist, but as a presence. He was the steady rhythm in the chaos, the clear voice in the storm. But what James didn't expect was how close the bond would become and how hard it would be to watch it all slowly fall apart. Witness to the King's final days. June 26, 1977. The Market Square Arena in Indianapolis buzzed with the kind of electric anticipation only Elvis Presley could summon. It would be his final concert, though no one, not even those closest to him, knew it at the time. For James Burton, it was just another stop on a long road of packed venues and nightly magic. But something felt different. Elvis, though smiling and full of charm, moved slower. His face was bloated, his eyes tired. Yet, when the music began, he delivered, as always. And when the time came for the solo, he turned and gave the familiar cue. "Play it, James!" Burton responded like he always had, with heart, precision, and a hint of fire. After the show, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no heavy conversations, just a nod, a handshake, and a casual, "See you soon?" That was the routine. Elvis was planning to rest at Graceland for a bit before the next round of shows. James, like the rest of the TCB band, went home, expecting the schedule to resume shortly. There was no reason to think anything was ending. But sometimes, the biggest farewells are the quietest ones. That night in Indianapolis was the last time James would ever see Elvis alive. Just a few weeks later, on August 16, 19, everything changed. James was back in Shreveport when he received the call. Elvis was gone. Found unresponsive in his Graceland bathroom, rushed to the hospital, and pronounced dead by 3:30 p.m. The news hit like a freight train. For James, it wasn't just the loss of an icon. It was the loss of a friend, a brother. They had stood side by side on a stage for nearly a decade, shared late-night gospel sessions, and talked about life, music, and faith. And now, it was over. Looking back, James says the signs were there. Elvis had been running on fumes, physically and emotionally drained by the relentless demands of fame and the expectations of an empire that never let up. That last tour, James admits quietly, should have been canceled. He saw it in Elvis's face, in his movements, in his mood. There was a heaviness that no amount of makeup or applause could cover. And yet, Elvis kept going. Because the stage was the only place where he felt truly alive. James doesn't place blame easily, but he's clear-eyed about the reality of those final months. Elvis wasn't just failed by his health, he was failed by the people who should have stepped in. There were those who pushed him too hard, James has said. They should have protected him instead. The king of rock and roll was surrounded, but not always supported. Too many saw the brand, not the man. Too many depended on him continuing to perform, no matter the cost. Still, James chooses to remember the light more than the darkness. That final show wasn't a disaster. It was a triumph in its own tragic way. Elvis, despite everything, gave his audience what they came for. He smiled, he joked, he sang, and he meant every word. And when he turned and said, "Play it, James," one last time, it wasn't just a musical cue. It was a final gesture of trust, friendship, and gratitude. James didn't get to say goodbye at Graceland. He wasn't there when the curtain truly fell, but in his heart, he says that final show was their goodbye. That final note played, that last glance across the stage, that was enough. And it stayed with him ever since. Elvis may have left the building, but James never left his side. And the memories they shared weren't all sadness. Some were beautiful. Elvis the man. James breaks his silence. Behind the jumpsuits, the explosive stage presence, and the deafening crowd screams, there was Elvis Presley, the man, And according to James Burton, that man was one of the kindest and most genuine people he ever had the honor of knowing. Elvis, he says, wasn't just a superstar chasing the next hit. He was a deeply thoughtful human being who always made time to check in on the people around him. He'd ask me how my wife was doing, how my kids were, James recalled. It wasn't small talk. He meant it. In a world full of ego and performance, Elvis's sincerity stood out. While others may have been blinded by the flash of fame, James saw someone who paid attention. He saw how Elvis would pause everything to ask a bandmate about a sick parent or offer to help when someone was struggling. That kindness didn't stop with the people in his immediate circle, it extended to almost everyone he met. Whether it was hotel staff, fans, or strangers he encountered in passing, Elvis had a way of making people feel seen. And for James, that was what truly made him special. That sense of generosity wasn't performative, it was part of who Elvis was. James has shared stories over the years that sound almost too generous to believe, yet he swears by every word. Like the time Elvis paid off someone's medical bills without ever revealing his name, or how he'd hand over a brand new car to a band member or friend without blinking. He once gave away a diamond-studded watch to someone who admired it during a conversation. He didn't care about things, James said. He cared about people. Even during holidays, Elvis made it a point to give back quietly, donating money to Memphis charities without seeking attention. But perhaps the most meaningful side of Elvis, at least to James, was his love for gospel music. Long after the crowds had gone home, after the lights dimmed and the crew packed up, Elvis would often gather the band in a quiet room or hotel suite just to sing. Gospel to him wasn't entertainment. It was spirit, connection, something real in a world that didn't always feel that way. We'd sing for hours sometimes, James remembered. He knew every word. You could see it in his eyes, how much it meant to him. It was in those moments, away from the cameras, when James felt he was seeing the truest version of Elvis. He wasn't the king in those late-night sessions. He was just a guy, one who could sing but had a heart and was yearning for something deeper. Many of the gospel songs he had grown up with turned out to be a kind of sanctuary. The only ones that could be classified under those were the songs that had Elvis not feeling the burden of performing, but impressing. He only had to sing. And to James, it was still amongst the highlights of his career to have shared those quiet, spiritual hours. Even decades later, James talks of Elvis soft and warm in his voice, not as an icon, but as a mate. He doesn't remember the excess or the fame or the chaos. He remembers this guy who cared. This was the guy who gave, the one who trusted him night after night with the music that meant everything. But while James cherished his time with Elvis, his journey didn't end in 1977. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter with another American icon. After Elvis, James Burton's second act. When Elvis Presley passed away in 1977, James Burton found himself standing at a painful crossroads. For nearly a decade, he had been the King's right-hand man on stage, his trusted musical partner, and one of the only people Elvis would call by name during a show. The loss left a void, both personal and professional. But James was not a man who stood still. And just months after Elvis's passing, another musical legend came knocking, John Denver. Denver, known for his clean vocals and heartfelt lyrics, reached out to James not just for his guitar skills, but for his soul. The connection was instant. What began as a session for Denver's I Want to Live album quickly grew into something much bigger. James didn't just play on one record, he became a vital part of Denver's sound for the next 15 years. They recorded 12 albums together, toured the world and developed a true friendship rooted in mutual respect and a love of music with meaning. On stage, James brought the same warmth and precision that had elevated Elvis's live shows. Off stage, he found healing in the rhythm of new beginnings. The partnership with Denver helped anchor James during a time of emotional transition. But his guitar was far from retired. In fact, the post-Elvis years saw James Burton become one of the most sought-after session musicians in the business once again. His name quietly appeared on records from artists as varied as Roy Orbison, Emmylou Harris, Elvis Costello, Merle Haggard, and Rodney Crowell. Across genres, rock, country, and folk, James brought the same clean tone, controlled flair, and unshakable timing that had made him famous. To many musicians, having James Burton play on your record was like adding gold to the grooves. One of his most celebrated moments came in 1988, when he performed in Roy Orbison and Friends, A Black and White Night, a televised concert that featured a dream lineup of musical icons. James stood among them not as a guest, but as a peer. He was no longer the young prodigy from Shreveport. He was now recognized as a pillar of American music. But while James continued to build on his professional legacy, he also began to think more about how he could give back. He founded the charity in 2005, which provides guitars and music education programs to children, hospitals, and schools around the nation. For James, it's not just about teaching music. Instead, it was also about handing over the same lifeline that had supported him from rural Louisiana to global stages. He believes that music can entertain and also save. The foundation expanded rather quickly. Using concert series, fundraising events, and sponsors, James raised thousands and personally delivered instruments to children who had never held a guitar before. Hospitals and schools became the venues for his sharing with young people about resilience, faith, and following one's calling. Those hands that had strummed alongside Elvis were now putting guitars into the hands of those who would dream tomorrow. James talks about others, the artists he has worked with, and the stages he has played upon. But more than anything, the heart of it all has been the core in the second chapter of his life. He was never one to follow the fame. He was, however, one to follow his purpose. His post-Elvis career was never about trying to pick up the pieces of what he lost, but rather to rebuild something new out of goodness, humility, and an overwhelming drive to share his art. But Burton's journey wasn't just musical. It was spiritual. And as the years passed, he faced trials that would test everything he'd built: survival, legacy, and the final truth. Even legends aren't immune to life's hardest trials. In his 80s, after decades of shaping American music from behind the scenes, James Burton found himself facing battles far away from the stage. A stroke came first, sudden and frightening, leaving everyone around him wondering if he'd ever play again. Then came COVID-19, a virus that hit him hard and left him physically weakened. As if that weren't enough, he suffered a broken hip and was soon diagnosed with kidney cancer. During one hospital stay, a reaction to anesthesia sent him into a coma for 12 days. Doctors feared the worst. It was the kind of storm few people survive intact. But James Burton did. It was almost as if the rhythm inside him refused to stop. After a lifetime of pushing through quiet disappointments, stolen credits, and exhausting tours, James once again rose from the darkness. Friends say his recovery wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. His faith played a massive role. So did the love of family, fans, and fellow musicians who saw in him not just a guitar hero, but a living thread of American music history. And in June 2023, he did what many thought he never would again. he stepped back onto a stage and led. The James Burton and Friends one-night-only concert at the London Palladium wasn't just a show, it was a victory. On that night, surrounded by giants like Queen's Brian May, Ronnie Wood, Van Morrison, and Elvis Costello, James stood tall, with his signature Telecaster in hand, and reminded the world exactly who he was. His fingers may have aged, but the sound was still unmistakable. Smooth, clean, fierce. A reminder that time could touch the body, but not the soul of a guitarist who had played through 5 decades of American music. The following year, in 2024, the music world finally gave him something long overdue: induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a crowning moment, one that recognized not only his work with country legends, but the genre-defining sound he helped shape from behind the curtain. From the dusty stages of Louisiana to the glittering halls of Nashville, James's journey had come full circle. James talks little about titles or accolades in reflecting on his past, spending time recalling Elvis instead. The interviews have seen him grow candid about the performer, but even more so about the man he knew. He would say that had Elvis lived, he would have turned his back on all the Vegas glamour in favor of gospel music, for that was where his heart was. James said he loved it more than anything else. It's the real Elvis who he asserts emerged in those late-night gospel jam sessions when everything else was quiet and the spotlight dimmed. He had so much more to give, he says wistfully now. He was kind, he was lost, he loved us, all of us, the fans, the band, the music. He gave everything he had. That is the last truth James Burton would ever dare present, truthfully, not as a musician, but as someone who stood beside Elvis when the world's eyes were on him and when no one else was watching. Today, every time James picks up a guitar, there's a sense of continuity, a sound, a soul, a memory that never quite leaves the strings. He doesn't just play chords, he plays history. And in those notes, you can still feel the echoes of the man who once shouted across the stage, "Play it, James!" And with every note James plays today, a little piece of Elvis still echoes. The king is gone, but his guitarist never stopped carrying the music forward. Even now, James isn't slowing down. He's just shifting focus. These days, he mentors young musicians, passing on not just technique, but the heart behind each note. He believes music should move people, not just impress them. Whether at a benefit show or a quiet jam, his presence carries quiet power, like history in the room. For James, legacy means being remembered not as the best, but as someone who lived for the music and stayed humble through it all. If you were moved by James Burton's incredible story and his deep bond with Elvis, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And be sure to click the next video on your screen for more untold stories from music legends who shaped history behind the spotlight.